Okay, so here's our bridging lecture. I'm going to say two things. One, I'm going to try, or three things actually. One, I'm going to try and keep it under 40 minutes since that's when it shuts off. So I don't want to have to start with the second one. And two, we have a marvelous class taught by John Dryford. So if you're interested in World War I, when the university gets back to its normalcy, I encourage you to take the course. And finally, I put a link to the film we would have seen for World War I. It's linked up on Blackboard. It provides a nice overview of the conclusion of the war, the discussions about how to create the peace treaty and what it means going forward. So all those things are there. I will also post these notes on Blackboard, but instead of looking at my face, you can look at the notes as we go along. And so off we go. Okay, so we're talking about World War I, and this is the culmination of the progressive plans. Progressives are those experts who want to manage everything. A brief overview of how the US got into the war. The war began in Europe in 1914. The war, as all the experts were certain, was going to be a quick war, but it was not. It quickly settled into a war of attrition, which meant massive inputs of food and material and men to keep the war effort going. Instead of a war of rapid movement, it became a war of bitter trench fighting. And the trenches locked into place. And for the next 4 odd years, there's very little movement along the trench lines until the armistice. The United States was neutral, as the president at the time, Woodrow Wilson, said, we must be neutral in thought and in deed. And neutrality meant they didn't officially favor either side. The two sets of combatants were on the Allied side. It was France, Britain, and Russia were the primary allies at the outset of the war. They were opposed by the Central Powers, as they were then known, which included Germany, Austro-Hungary, which was the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and Turkey. What this meant in practical effect is that the Germans and the Austro-Hungarians were fighting a two-front war, fighting a war in the east against the Russians and the war in the west against the British and the French, largely again locked into trenches. So this war of attrition meant that men and material and supplies were of crucial importance to the war effort. One of the triggering events for the war was the Germans' effort to construct a navy to challenge the British. But the British naval superiority meant that the German navy stayed bottled up in their ports and harbors. So that meant that the surface of the ocean was controlled by the British and the Allies, which meant not only British military ships could sail hither and yon, it also meant that the merchants could travel. The Germans had sought to address this by constructing a fleet of what they called U-boats, which were submarines that operated below the surface, and their job was to patrol the North Atlantic and to sink ships that were supplying the British and French. So as you can see, this conflict spun out quickly from what it was anticipated into a long slog. Men and material in particular in the early part of the war were of crucial importance for both sides, but because of the British Navy, only Allied shipping could travel around the globe and pick up material, which meant the United States, which had officially been neutral, began to tilt more to the Allied side because that's who was showing up to buy all the stuff they needed, which the United States was producing in great quantity. So to combat this, the Germans were sinking ships, but in sinking ships, they were also killing American citizens, which was making the American public angry, who was pressuring Congress and pressuring the president. So Throughout 1915, as British U-boats were sinking Allied ships, they were killing Americans, and there was increasing tension. So what happened was the Germans pulled back their U-boat from around all of the North Atlantic and concentrated it primarily around the British Isles and the French coasts. They consciously sought to limit the amount of ships that were from neutral places, that would be the United States, because they didn't want to provoke the United States into joining the war. So this type of events continued through 1915 through 1916, and the war ground on, wearing out the men and material of all sides. The Germans faced a desperate point. They projected that they would run out of the stuff to keep the troops in the field, and they were fighting a two-front war against the Russians in the east and the British and French in the west. So they made a desperate gamble that was comprised of two parts. One was to unleash a massive operation against the Russians in the east with the intent of driving them out of the war. Combined with that was an unleashing of U-boats to sink all the ships they possibly could on the North Atlantic. Now, the Germans knew that this unleashed U-boat campaign was likely to kill American citizens, which would outrage the American public, which would put pressure on the Congress and the president to enter the war on the side of the Allies. They understood that, but their plan was they were going to knock the Russians out of the war, bring the troops over to the Western Front from now freed up from the Eastern Front, and to capture Paris before the United States troops could enter into the conflict and make any sort of impact. That was the plan. So step one worked. They unleashed a massive assault on the Russians. They also secretly released a radical from their prisons by the name of Lenin, and they sent him to Russia, where he agitated for a revolution and was successful, leading the communist revolution, who sued for peace with the Germans. These freed up troops were now able to be trained across the frontier to the Western Front and unleash a war. Meanwhile, in April of 1917, the continuing outrage of sinking ships and a diplomatic fiasco in which German diplomats were discovered by British spies to be making promises to the Mexicans that they would give back all the territory they lost in the 1849 Mexican War, provoked massive outrage, and the United States declared war. When the United States declared war, they were woefully unprepared for this massive conflict. Woodrow Wilson was very aware of that, and he knew that in order to have an impact on this conflict, that the U.S. needed to rapidly improve its military forces, but also to produce on the very large scale and in very short order all the material necessary for this new conflict. To do this, he recognized he needed the experts, and so he turned to the progressives. I might note that Woodrow Wilson called himself a progressive. He won the 1912 election. He was one of the four candidates who all ran as progressives of a type. So the U.S. is now in the war after April 1917, and the progressives are set to work to manage this process. This activist state is going to prepare and equip massive amounts of troops and deliver them to the battlefield across the ocean in Europe. To manage this process, the progressives created what was known as the War Industries Board. The War Industries Board was a perfect example of how the progressives saw the world. A small group of experts who were going to manage this process for the benefit of the nation, even though it was going to impact the desires of private industry. And I'll give you an example. So for this conflict, steel was something that would be in high demand. You need steel for ships, you need steel for bayonets, you need steel for bullets, you need steel for howitzers, you need steel for railroads to deliver these things. Steel is in great demand, far more demand than the steel mills at the time could possibly produce. If we allowed the market to operate, that steel would go to the highest bidder. As a small sidebar, it reminds me over the current issue of the demand for ventilators. Everybody needs a ventilator. So who's getting the ventilators? The people willing to pay the most money. This may or may not be where things are most needed, but by pure market demands, it will go to the highest bidder. Same with steel. Shipbuilders need steel, railroads need steel, howitzer makers need steel, helmet makers need steel. Everybody needs steel, far more than the current supply of steel. In this pure market-driven system, if shipbuilders are paying the most for steel, then shipbuilders would get all the steel, which would mean we'd have plenty of ships to bring things across the Atlantic Ocean to Europe, but we wouldn't have the things to put in the boats. We wouldn't have soldiers with helmets and rifles and bayonets. We wouldn't have railroads delivering stuff to the ports. We wouldn't have bullets and shells and all those things, because if steel goes to the highest bidder, then it will only go to who's paying the most money, not the most efficient use for production. The War Industries Board said, we're going to control this production as experts. And so we're going to allocate a certain percentage of the steel to shipbuilders. We're going to allocate some to railroads. We're going to allocate some to helmet makers, to munitions plants. Everybody who needs it is going to be allocated so that collectively we can prepare the nation and for this ongoing conflict, right? The key to all this is efficiency. This is the drive these experts are making promises about what they're trying to produce. Maximizing efficiency and limiting inefficiencies is one of the key elements of this War Industries Board, and it controls virtually everything. It controls industrial production, it controls agricultural production, it controls the training of men. Everything is under these auspices. Limiting inefficiencies is also part of it too. So it's not just increasing efficiency, it's also limiting inefficiencies. Strikes are inefficient. When the workers go on strike, it has an impact, as we saw with the UMW strike of 1902. When the workers went on strike in the coal mines, it meant not only that the coal mines weren't producing coal, so there were no profits for coal mine owners, the coal wasn't available for the railroad owners, who were the same people in this case, but it also wasn't available for industries that were not owned by these coal mine owners or railroad owners. So it impacted breweries, it impacted steel manufacturing, it impacted everything, because everybody used coal, including people heating their own houses, right? So the impact of that strike in one sector, coal mining, could cripple a lot of sectors. That would be very inefficient for the war effort. So as a subgroup of this War Industries Board, there was a creation of something known as the National War Labor Board. This board was empowered under the emergency powers of the War Industries Board to do the following. It was to protect and negotiate the right of collective workers in unions to air their grievances. So instead of going on strike if the workers are feeling mistreated, they can go to the National War Labor Board and say, this company's mistreating me. And so that board would hear the complaints and then could compel the companies to meet the strikers' demands, or the workers' demands, not strikers, the workers' demands, or could say they don't have a case, right? But they're empowered to be an arbitrary or an arbiter in this dispute. They also dictated to companies that they would pay higher wages to their workers. This, of course, is one of the concerns of the workers, is that they're being poorly paid. So the National War Labor Board could order companies to pay their workers more, and they did. Now, by statute, they didn't have an enormous amount of legal power, but they had power in another way. So one of the companies that was not interested in paying their workers more was Ford Motor Company. So the National War Labor Board lacked the legal authority to order them to do so, but they had other levers of power to make them do so. So when Ford Motor Company, and Ford in particular, said, I'm already paying my workers well, I don't need to pay them more, and certainly not under your orders, the National War Labor Board appealed to the War Industries Board about the allocation of resources. So Ford Motor Company had an enormous amount of contracts. The government was buying every truck that Ford could build for the war effort. But in order to build trucks, you need steel. So the War Industries Board made it known to Ford Motor Company that if you're not interested in working with us on paying the workers more, we're not interested in making sure you get all the steel to fulfill those government contracts that are going to pay you very well. This is a very effective lever. And so Ford Motor Company allowed the National War Labor Board to dictate its relations with its workers during the war. Now, thinking back over the course of things we've discussed in this progressive era, this is a different stance for the federal government. It is actively supporting the rights of workers to negotiate for better things as a collective. It's also compelling private industry to recognize these workers' unions and these workers' complaints, and is also serving a role as an arbiter between their disputes. This is very out of the norm, and it's part of this emergency war effort. This effort to create new Americans or to create more efficient Americans, one of the strings or streams of this progressive era is also manifest in these ideas of what they wanted the American people to be like. So one of the things was the progressives who are running these acculturation efforts are wanting to eliminate what they called hyphen Americans. So they're not Italian Americans or Irish Americans. They're saying they're just Americans. And so this is not just a public propaganda effort. It is that, but it also carries with it some compulsion. And so they pass laws about the coercive elements of the Alien Act or the Alien Enemies Act and the Sedition Act. So it was made seditious to speak up against the United States war effort. These are all things about compelling adherence to the U.S. war effort. And there was also unofficial efforts, things known as the American Protective League, who were given sort of a tacit permission from the government to use social force to compel people. So the American Protective League would beat up people for speaking German, right? Because that's the language of the enemy. And so they were also trying to stamp out radical elements. It also takes the form of a quasi-government entity known as the Committee on Public Information. This is to propagandize the war, to talk about how we're fighting for civilization. This took the form of some, what we would say a little bit silly at these times, but I might point out they're not unprecedented in American history, even in recent American history. So sauerkraut, a German name for that product, was renamed Liberty Cabbage. French toast replaced German toast. I didn't know that French toast originally was known as German toast, but French toast replaces the name German toast. A hamburger is referred to as a Liberty steak. So all these things are seem in retrospect kind of silly, but they're kind of illustrative of the social pressures on adhering to these ideas of what a good American is. All these things are about preventing or maximizing U.S. effort to prepare for the war. And so in that sense, you can see things like prohibition, right? So it is inefficient to use grains to produce liquor or beer, right? So that should be turned into bread to feed our hungry soldiers and allies. So you can see how other progressive goals like prohibition get mixed into this as kind of a war effort. Good things come out of this as well. Clearly I feel prohibition is bad, but good or bad, prohibition comes about because of that. But good things come out of this as well, because this suffrage movement, giving women the right to vote, the pressure came because women suffrage folks demonstrated outside the White House and were arguing that this is a war that the president was calling a war for democracy. Yet here in the United States, women can't vote. It sounds very undemocratic. And so that pressure effort tied up to the war effort convinced Woodrow Wilson to support a federal amendment to give women the right to vote. As he said, women's effort in the war has earned them the right to vote. And so all these things are bound up. So World War I is the apex of this progressive movement in shaping American life. It is right as it hits this apex that it comes to its denouement as well. I think I have another set of notes on this page. Let's see. Oh, yes. So women win the vote, the 19th Amendment, as part of the vital effort to win the war. Progressives are controlling many aspects of American life. The federal government is not just maximizing the effort to produce material for the war, it's intruding into everybody's life. It's prohibiting liquor, it's preventing newspapers being printed in German. Some of these newspapers have been published since the early 1800s, but now that the German is the language of the enemy, so there's a lot of pressure. Unions of workers are expanding at this time, although the public is generally unhappy about this effort, but this desire to prevent strikes allowed this to occur. The conclusion of the war, this American Protection League morphs into this sort of Americanism run amok. And it is, in retrospect, not a surprise that in this immediate post-war period, you have the expansion of the Ku Klux Klan. 1921 was the year of the largest Klan enrollment, right? You can see a straight line from this idea of American protectionism, of mandating what it is, self-determined to be an American, then taking the form of a post-war anti-immigrant, anti-Black, anti-Catholic, anti-Jew focus of this Klan idea. The war ends when the United States forces begin to arrive in Europe. The desperate attempt by the Germans to capture Paris grinds to a halt as American troops are thrown into the breach, aiding the British and the French in stopping the German offensive. The Germans recognize that they have lost the roll of the dice. They have expended all their effort in trying to capture Paris. When they came up short, the Allies begin to slowly grind them back, and they are being driven back to the German frontier. Most of the war of the Western Front was fought in France. So as they're being driven back to the German frontier, the German military and German government sues for peace, and they agree to an armistice on November 11th at 11:11 a.m. The guns fall silent. The peace has been declared as part of a temporary break. This temporary break has to be negotiated into a permanent settlement. The film picks up with this sort of negotiations. And so in the film, you're going to see two aspects of it. So you have the Allies and their desire, the British and the French in particular. What do they want? And then you have the United States. Woodrow Wilson promoted this war as an idealistic vision of what peace should be. And in his vision, this old world of empires that the British, the French, the Germans, the Russians, the Austro-Hungarians embodied was to be wiped away. And a new world based upon widespread democracy would be created. And instead of treaties and warfare and violence being the way that order is maintained, he envisioned a new world order that would center around the collective actions of states in a body he called the League of Nations. All these ideas that he promoted for what the world would look like afterwards are embodied in his 14-point speech, which I have linked onto Blackboard. This is a very idealistic vision of how the world and peace will be maintained after the conclusion of this horrible war. And it is one in which Wilson asserted this would be a war without victors. This is not what the peace treaty delivered. The peace treaty, as you will see in the film, delivered a measure of blame and burden onto the defeated states. the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which was a multi-ethnic empire, imploded under the conflict. And so out of the wreckage of this empire, a series of new states were created. States like Austria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, right? These are states that are created out of this multi-ethnic Austro-Hungarian empire. The greatest burden and blame was foisted onto the shoulders of the German state, whose government collapsed. And out of the wreckage of that government, there was a disordered attempt to create a new government, all of which we'll see in the film. Here in the United States, the conclusion of the war set off a sort of backlash against what they determined to be radicals. Most radical of all is the communists that were the outcome of the successful Russian Revolution. Woodrow Wilson lobbied hard for the United States to join the League of Nations. And so with the conclusion of his term coming in 1920, shortly upon his return, when he was lobbying the American public to pressure the United States Senate to allow the United States to join the League of Nations, he suffered a stroke and was incapacitated. The 1920 election then became a sort of public referendum on what the United States should be doing in this international world. Should the United States continue to be involved? Should the progressive intrusion into individual life continue? These are the issues placed before the American public. And you have a candidate running for the Republicans, a man by the name of Warren G. Harding, who's running on a slogan he calls a return to normalcy. Normalcy for Warren G. Harding is the United States not being involved in international affairs or fighting wars in Europe. Normalcy means the federal government should not be involved in regulating industry. Normalcy means the government should not be involved in the private lives of individuals. Mainly, it's a return to this idea of laissez-faire, hands-off activity by the government. This is put before the American public. Should they vote for a candidate who's going to continue Woodrow Wilson's legacy, or are they going to reject the whole effort of Woodrow Wilson and this vision for the United States in the post-war world? What are they going to do? And so 1920 election is another one of those watershed elections in which the American people vote overwhelmingly for Warren G. Harding and his vision of what the world should be, which is a world in which the United States is self-isolated. The 1920 election foists Warren G. Harding on the nation. He served for 3 years and then died of a heart attack in the arms of his mistress. He's replaced by his vice president, a man by the name of Calvin Coolidge. Coolidge, nicknamed Silent Cal, envisioned a government which was largely hands-off. It was a vision in which private industry regulated itself, in which the government sought to do a very minimal role, and that was his vision of how the world would work. Harding and Coolidge were both very conservative, pro-business Republicans. They represented that wing of the government. Coolidge decided he would not run for re-election after he won election on his own in 1924. So in 1928, he handed a slip of paper to reporters and said, "I choose not to run." And so another member of the president's cabinet, Mr. Hoover, decides he's going to run for president. And so all through the 1920s, what's known as the Roaring Twenties, this government is run by very conservative, pro-business, low-regulation Republicans. Although, as we shall see in our next discussion, Hoover is a little bit more complicated. Prohibition is the law of the land. So you have speakeasies, mob wars in Chicago, New York, and other places. And it's a world largely concerned with domestic affairs and largely removed itself from international affairs. The United States entered a period what's known as isolationism. This is the bridge. We're going to pick up our next lecture with the setting for things right before the Great Depression, and then also the early days of the Great Depression next time. I know I've gone through this very quickly, so if you have any questions, I have a discussion board set up, and I encourage you to post your questions there. All right, see you next time.